Breaking free. I drove north, away from the city, on the Taconic, one of New York's old tree-lined parkways. I followed the signs toward the place where my ex-boyfriend Keith had asked me to meet him. It was late August. The leaves on the trees were as broad and green as they would ever be that year, but they appeared to be hanging on until the end, until the first cool nights would cry for them to let down their color. My old Dodge rattled and leaned to the right whenever I put on the brakes, its shoes worn down to the metal. I was tired of repairing it, I realized, and I decided to sell it in the fall. I had not seen Keith for several weeks. I tried to end things with him before I left for a wilderness sailing trip to Maine with Outward Bound, a trip I'd just returned from. I was fairly certain that I didn't want to see him again. We had met at work. Keith was witty and interesting and loved the arts as much as I did. His confidence and eloquence, qualities I wanted very much for myself, pleased and inspired me. We were both dogged by the dynamics of former painful relationships. Soon after we started dating, I realized that for some reason, he didn't want anyone at work to know that we were seeing each other. Our relationship was a night blooming plant anyway. It seemed to exist only in the evening. In the light of day, we didn't quite know how to be together, what to say. We needed the low light, the promise of a little shadow, and wine to revive the drying petals of our togetherness. We were both drawn to writing and theater and had both attempted to write. But when I shared a piece of my writing with Keith, he made no comment. The longer I stayed with him, the less I wrote, and the less I talked about my writing. He never asked to see my drawings, even though he knew I took classes at the Pratt Institute on Saturday mornings. And so I drew less. I also spoke less. I went from being inspired by his wit to being so intimidated by it that by the time I went on my sailing trip, I developed a stutter. I interpreted Keith's disinterest to mean that our twosome was to be a place for him to perform and direct. And how did I respond? I cleared the stage of our relationship and placed myself in the wings. This was not solely his fault. I helped fashion the hook that pulled me off the stage and into those wings. Yet, I agreed to this meeting. Even though a lot of pain had gone between us, he was still in some ways my friend. When I arrived home from my trip, he was the one calling and expecting me to call. Also, when he phoned and asked me to meet him, he was his funny self, the self I loved, the man I'd met 7 months ago, the one who asked me out on our first date by lobbing a hand-wrought scroll over the partition that separated our cubicles at work, a parchment scroll that, when unrolled, promised a homemade dinner of veal medallions and parsleyed potatoes, followed by a performance by Sheila the Dancing Seal. It was that man who called and asked to see me again. I thought maybe he had changed. Maybe things would be different after our separation. As I drove north, I think I was somewhere in between saying goodbye and wanting to make sure I was making the right decision. His directions worked fine. I parked in front of an apartment building surrounded by green lawn and weeping willows. Keith answered my knock right away, and we smiled and we embraced briefly. His hair was freshly cut. He smelled like soap. He was a boyish man with straight bangs and gapped front teeth. Although Keith's haircut was new and I saw an expensive new book bag on the couch, what was not new was the fact that we were meeting in a borrowed space, a neutral space. The apartment belonged to Keith's sister and her husband. We had spent most of our time together in places like that. On the streets of New York, in the twin seats facing backward on the subway, at restaurant tables, in theaters, places belonging to no one and everyone. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Though I had told him how good my trip was on the phone, he didn't ask about Maine, and I didn't offer any more details, even though I had a lot to say. Just a week earlier, I had gripped a climbing rope between my fists, leaned backward over the side of an 85-foot rock cliff, and lowered my body by degrees to a sandy beach below. I didn't think I could do it. Didn't think I could take those steps over the edge, but I did. "I have some things for you," he said. From the fawn-colored leather satchel on the couch, he pulled out 2 boxes. A small one the size of a pen, and a larger one that I imagined held a scarf. The boxes were not wrapped, but the larger one was tied with a length of yellow and red climbing rope, the same kind of rope that had held me days earlier. I smiled at the rope, but kept my eyes down. I sat on the edge of the couch, my back straight, my fingers tense. Inside the small box was a pocket knife. Its telltale red casing and silver cross the first thing I saw. I loved the knife, and I was happy to have it. Keith watched me. I worked the rope off the larger box, its skin feeling as smooth and cool as a snake's. I felt seen by Keith for the very first time, if only glimpsed, And I imagined him for a moment in the sporting goods store asking a clerk for a length of rope, thinking of me, thinking of how he'd use the rope to decorate the package. My face warmed with the thought of him thinking of me when I wasn't with him, but the feeling was fleeting. The rope was only 2 feet long, nothing I could really use, not a rope I could wrap around my waist and take to the gunks, the cliffs just north of here. Still, I appreciated this gesture and coiled it with care and placed it on the coffee table next to the knife. The lid on the box shimmied up and off, and inside lay a shimmering, cream-colored silk slip, the kind I liked. Thin straps, a modest V-neck, a panel of pearly softness that would float all the way down to the tops of my sun-bronzed knees. "Thanks," I said, and looked away. I folded the slip and returned it to the box. He suddenly blurted, "You went on the trip I was supposed to have gone on." The refrigerator stopped its cycle. Silence billowed around us. What was he talking about? My trip had nothing to do with him. In the next moment, I thought about stone and water. I remembered setting anchor, sitting watch at night. I remembered straining my entire body against an oar, using every muscle to help get the boat through dangerous shallows. I remembered climbing and rappelling off that cliff. Most of all, I remembered what it had felt like to be on stage, and to share that stage equally with others. "I need to go," I said. I dumbly collected the gifts and got up. He followed me out of the apartment and walked with me toward my car. Outside, the incessant drone from the air conditioner boxes met us and filled the space between us. Heat from the asphalt burned through the soles of my shoes. When we reached the car, he wordlessly got in on the passenger side. He reached over, put his arms around me, and made a sound that I had never heard before. He shook and sobbed. I put my arms around him, and we sat like that in the parking lot for several long minutes. I kept my arms around him as long as he wanted me to. My awareness left my body, and I imagined what I must have looked like from across the street, a woman divided. A woman who appeared to be consoling a man, but who was looking out the windshield as if she was tired of this, had done this before, was putting in her time. Finally, he stopped crying. I asked him if he was all right. Without a word, he got out of the car. I dragged the gear shift over, pressed the accelerator, and opened the steady flow of fuel to the engine, all the way back to the parkway. Let's hear it for Ellen.